Following the message of the Federal Minister of Justice of the Republic of Austria, Alma Zadic, we continue the conference with a panel titled "The Judiciary as the Guardian of Fundamental Values, Keeping the Rule of Law at the Center of the EU Accession Policy." Our distinguished panelists include Angelika Nussberger, Vice President of the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Christoph Grabenwarter, President of the Austrian Constitutional Court, Claire Bazy-Malaurie, President of the Venice Commission, Mirjana Lazarova Trajkovska, Judge at the Supreme Court of the Republic of North Macedonia. The discussion will be moderated by Hans Dietmar Schweisgut, Secretary General of the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe.
Parallel to this panel, we have the other one just across, Forgotten Humanity, Ongoing Conflicts and the Challenge of Multiple Crises, with the participants of Thomas Meyer-Harting, former EEAS Managing Director, former Ambassador of the EU and Austria to the UN in New York, Udo Jude Ilo, Senior Fellow, Center for Civilians in Conflict and founding partner, Thoughts and Mace Advisory, Yoko Hirose, Professor, Faculty of Policy Management, Keio University, with moderating of Marta Martinelli, non-resident scholar at Carnegie Europe.
Enjoy the panel.
Good afternoon and welcome to our panel. We have already in previous sessions, starting with the opening panel yesterday, heard about enlargement and the accession process in the context of the new geopolitical reality in Europe, especially after the war of aggression of Russia in Ukraine. The enlargement process, not only with the perspective of membership for the Ukraine and Moldova, but also with the feeling that renewed impetus for the Western Balkans is something which would contribute to the peace, security, and stability in Europe, was something which was mentioned also in a different context this morning. We are looking at something which is not related to the geopolitical change in Europe, but it's something which has been, if I may say so, an immovable part of the accession process since the beginning more than 20 years ago. And this is, of course, that stability, security, prosperity in Europe has always been defined in the larger context also of democracy, protection of human rights, rule of law, minorities, functioning institutions, and so forth. They are well summarized in two chapters of the accession process, chapters 23 and 24, which remain center stage, even if the feeling is that the accession process has been going on now for a very long time. Some feel already for too long, and have to a certain extent also led to a feeling of enlargement fatigue, both in the European Union, but also in the future member states. Before we go to some of the specific questions related to the role of the judiciary, constitutional courts, etc., maybe I would ask one or two panelists, how do you see, more than 20 years after the opening of the accession process, not the opening of negotiations, of course, progress in the area of the judiciary, the rule of law, human rights, if you want, as a new starting point for this new dynamism. Madame Bazy-Malaurie, would you have a comment on that?
Thank you. First, I have to say something here, because we're talking about EU. We're talking about human rights, we're talking about the judiciary, we're talking about democracy. But I must say that for the Venice Commission, we stand for the Council of Europe. Nobody would talk here about the Council of Europe but in fact the Council of Europe is an old European institutions which stands for democracy, human rights, and rule of law. And since the end of the Second World War. And it had another beginning, if I can say that, in 1990, something which sounds clear in some of the ears inside this hall. And then was created the Venice Commission. And Venice Commission doesn't work for architecture or art or whatever it is, but Venice Commission has been created to answer to those countries which were joining the Council of Europe. That means they're signing the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights in Europe. And the mission, the mandate that was given to the Venice Commission was to answer to the countries which wanted to go away from their authoritarian past and join the democratic world. And since that time, the countries which make the Venice Commission at the moment, we are 46 members. We were 47. Well, okay, 46 members, and the Venice Commission is composed, I just say that, of one member for one country. We're all designated by our countries, but we are completely independent. Our mandate is very clear, and we sit all together just to agree on what we call opinions. And it's very important to understand that our opinions, we are not a court. But I must say that we work inside the Council of Europe, but being inside of the Council of Europe doesn't mean that we are under the hierarchy of the Council of Europe. We are an autonomous body. And at the moment, we are more than 46 members in the Venice Commission, 61 members coming from abroad from Europe, coming from Latin America, from Middle East, and we have some observers like the United States, but we have also Japan, for instance. So we have a broad view on what could mean for the countries which are requesting opinions from the Venice Commission. We have a broad view on what works, what really answer to our three pillars: democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And that's very important to understand that. And we have a lot of experience, in fact, because since 1990, we, shall I say, accompanied many, many countries. I can say perhaps all of the countries which are on this part of Europe, just to limit our work on that part. And we have a lot of experience. We think that we can bring something, a real support, and if there is something like which could resemble between the EU and the Venice Commission, it's just because the EU found in the Venice Commission an expert body who, well, could be criticized, of course, but in fact, really very profoundly, it is not criticized so much, and that can help the European Commission and the European Parliament, but also all the countries to understand what is at stake when they are trying to join all the principles and values, which are the same, in fact, between European Union and the Council of Europe. But the Council of Europe has only one tool, which is the European Court of Human Rights. it has otherwise sort of, you know, the only tool is about what is said in the medias and things like that. But that's the way it works. But that's also why, because of our methods of work, we can follow all the countries which want to request opinions, sometimes opinions requested by the Council of Europe, but we think really that we can support very effectively all the countries. And, well, perhaps the main thing is to say that we are looking for many, and we have many requests coming from the countries themselves, not only from the Council of Europe.
Thank you very much, and I think this is very important to see that the Council of Europe, and especially the Venice Commission, whose official title I found out is the Euro Commission for Democracy Through Law, which I think sums it up very nicely. Yeah? My next question would be a bit, if we look at the opinions, and I think if we look at everything which was done over the last 20 years or even more, where do we stand in terms of implementation? And I would like maybe to ask the question to Madame Trajkovska, because the idea was always that real progress is also linked a bit to the incentive of becoming members of the European Union. Now, if that perspective recedes or becomes more remote, we have seen, as the Commission in its annual reports also noted, that it also tends to mean that there is a bit of a slippage in terms of implementation with regard to the judiciary, with regard to specific legislation and its implementation, with regard to politicization of the system. You are a judge at the Supreme Court in North Macedonia. How would you see that, both for your country, but also more generally for the region?
Well, for the region and for my country as well, I can say that there were steps ahead and steps backwards. Now, looking into the new report of the European Commission, the evaluation is that there are slight or minor improvements in the reforming of the judiciary. And it's not only on one country, it goes for most of the countries in the region. This does reflect the necessity for a quick start of assessment negotiations, because it is exclusively important to intensify dialogue between national courts and European institutions. We can say that in past more than 30 years, we are in a process of reforming judiciary, not only regular judiciary, but also constitutional courts. But does this mean effective judiciary? Judiciary which is ready to protect citizens in a way that it should be, or most of the reforms are done in a form of changing legislation, which is not always implemented, or it's not always well implemented. And that's why we have, of course, Venice Commission as a counterpartner when the legislation is drafted, but when the processes of implementation of legislation are somehow becoming slow or not at all functional, then we are receiving grades like slight or minor changes into the judiciary. So the process of going ahead with the reforms is quite complex, and it requires a broader judicial culture than just writing legislation and declaring that we have strategies for judicial reforms.
Mm-hmm. On that last point, Mr. Grabenwarter, you have been for many years very active in also fostering relations between the Constitutional Court in Austria and also organizations throughout the region. And you have always also insisted on the fact that strong institutions, a strong judiciary is a precondition for sustainability and a lasting change in this constitutional culture. What was your experience over the last year when you also had contacts with your colleagues throughout the region, and how do you see the possibility of supporting this reform process through exchange of experience and bilateral contacts?
Yes, thank you. You are mentioning an important point, and Mirjana has just referred to constitutional culture. And if we talk about development of constitutional culture, we have to keep in mind a saying which is, Rome hasn't been built in one day. And this is basically the issue we are talking about. You can draft a constitution within a few weeks. We have examples for this. But you cannot develop constitutional culture within a few months. This is something which has to grow in the minds of politicians, grow in the minds of lawyers, in the minds of judges. And that's where we stand now. We sometimes expect younger states to develop very fast, and we sometimes forget that in other parts of Europe, it took us also decades to achieve what we have now. I don't want to say we should wait another 30 years. This is not my point. The point is that we stick to the point that we assist each other in learning from each other, and to be, and this is something which is very important to me, not to think that we know better because we have a little bit more of tradition, but that we learn from each other, that we assist each other, and that we understand each other. Because each country has its own issues and problems, and in particular the Venice Commission is built up, has a variety of legal traditions, and a group of rapporteurs which goes to a country for a country visit, maybe an Icelandic member, a member of Spain, someone from Poland, someone from Rome, someone from Germany. And there you have various traditions. Perhaps one point adding to what you said. The constitutional courts are constantly interacting with each other. Perhaps we can come to specific issues later on. But the important thing is we are doing this not only because of accession proceedings. The Council of Europe, in its statute, has a similar obligation to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. So what we are working on constantly is to improve the quality of the rule of law, of the judiciary, even beyond minimum requirements that may be in an accession proceedings. And we do not know where the journey goes, but we are convinced that we have to improve the judiciary in all member states and to take measures against backsliding, which is an issue which has came up very strongly during the last 10 years.
Nussberger, you are a very special case because you're an international judge and vice president at the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It would be interesting to hear a bit your experience, because the court there, of course, is also plagued with the fact that I think there are no Serbian or no judges from the Republika Srpska at the moment serving. How does the court deal with this situation, and how do you see this unique system of having international judges, and is that accepted? How does it work?
Yes, it's Bosnia-Herzegovina is a very special case. We all know why there are international judges at this court, because it was necessary in the day, seen as a necessity after the civil war and after the period, the very difficult period of the country, to rebuild the country and to rebuild a constitutional culture for them. At that time, it was seen as necessary to have a composition of the Constitutional Court that is different from the compositions of constitutional courts in other countries. And we do have 3 international judges to bring some outside perspective into the inside perspective of the domestic judges. This is a system that is not loved by the people in the country, so there is always this idea of changing, which is good, but it has to be changed in a consensus. So they have to find a way how to reform the system in a consensus, and as long as there is no consensus on the reform, the international judges are essential, because otherwise the whole system would fall apart. As you rightly mentioned, there are no more judges from Republika Srpska. The last judge has left, so in 2024 we are without our 2 colleagues from Republika Srpska, and the most important is to hold the court together in a situation of political turmoil. And as Christoph Grabenwarter has said, legal reforms are slow and a constitutional culture is built up over many decades, but it must not go in the opposite direction. So it is one step after the other to go in a good direction. And if it goes in the opposite direction as a disruption of the state, then it's very dangerous. We can have patience, but it must not go in the wrong direction. And that's actually what we see right now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We were very grateful to the Venice Commission to adopt an opinion on how to overcome the crisis in the court. The court has, in a sort of self-defense, adopted provisions that judges can sit longer until they are replaced by new judges, because otherwise there would be no more quorum. So the court is in a difficult situation, and for the time being, I think the international judges are necessary, but only for the time being. It's not a permanent solution.
Madame Bazy-Malaurie, you explained in your opening statement more or less the role of the Venice Commission, the instrument of opinions, which are of course not limited to the countries in the region, but go way beyond. You also mentioned that the Venice Commission has not the means and the mandate, of course, to enforce the opinions. But how do you basically support the follow-up? Does it happen sometimes that opinions are ignored simply, or only very partially implemented, or is there an instrument basically to put your finger on certain points in your opinion, saying, but we mentioned this and that in our opinion, and the country we addressed it to has not really followed up on?
That was sometimes a critic that was given to the Venice Commission, because we write an opinion, we issue it publicly and things like that, and then what's going on after? Well, first, there's two things I want to say. First, when we issue an opinion, we have about, at the moment, we have about 40, sometimes to 50 opinions a year. So that means quite a huge work from a very small secretariat in Strasbourg, and we make a follow-up of what happens after the opinion was issued. But it's a very short follow-up. Well, we talk about laws. We talk about regulations. We're not talking in Venice Commission about public policies. We're talking about laws which are submitted to the Venice Commission from the country or for the Council of Europe to give an opinion on the law. So what happens is, well, it could happen nothing at all, but it could happen also that changes are made in the law itself, or something happens which can make the things going, well, you know, in another, in the right path or in another one. So we are informed of that, and of course, we say that, and it's published in our report anyhow. But we have also nowadays follow-up opinions. That means that from the Venice Commission itself, or from the Parliamentary Assembly of the Committee of Ministers in the Council of Europe, or coming from the country, we've been asked to to issue an opinion on something which is different from the first one, and giving an opinion on the new legal mechanism which was put on the table. So that's one. Secondly, I mean, we have a lot of audience coming from the NGOs generally, from the civil society, from the medias, because all our works are public. And when we go to in a mission, we meet not only authorities, and it's an obligation. We meet public, we meet associations, we meet civil society, we meet whoever wants to talk to us. We meet media, someone. So everybody is waiting something from the Venice Commission. And so, you know, it's not only a bilateral dialogue between experts and the authorities. All the stakeholders are driven into the mechanisms, and this is very, very important for the Venice Commission. We don't work anyhow. And if we cannot meet people, we'll say it, and it will be said in the opinion. What I have to say as well, it's just going on about what said Christoph at the moment. It's very important to understand that whatever could be said about the obligations, about redrafting laws and things like that, it takes time. And what we saw is that, you know, once there is this huge stake that becoming a member of the EU, generally authorities try to go the quicker they can go. But it's not the good way. Because in fact, as we said, it's not only about drafting a law, it's just first drafting a law which has some sort of meaning. That means it has to be the work of inclusive work. What was the impact assessment of the law? What was the preparatory work for this law? And second, it won't work, you know, it's not a magic stick. And it's not because you just kick the box of the rule of law criteria that it will work. Because everything, especially about the judiciary, but not only about the judiciary, takes time, because we have to take on board traditions, culture, the way people work. That the effectiveness, which is at the end of the process. We can say that about accession, about countries that are in an accession process, but I can say that for every country. Well, in my country, it's exactly the same thing. It takes time, and you have to be aware that, especially when you're talking about huge reforms, well, the process has to be managed. The authorities have to assess the risks they are taking when renewing something very fundamental as the judiciary. And you have to monitor the process. Don't you know, imagine that it will take 6 months. It won't be that way. That's the second lesson about the follow-up. And the follow-up is very difficult because of that. It takes time. And that's why sometimes we see, when I see the list of the opinions of the Venice Commission, I mean, well, we have already said that 10 years ago, yes. But we'll meet some situation which would be quite different. And generally, may I say that we think that things are not so better that we can hope for, but generally they're on the better way.
That, if I may, a follow-up question, that sounds very convincing, and obviously we realize that building systems and a constitutional culture takes time, but what can we do at the same time to avoid the impression that the argument, it takes time, also means that the enlargement process is stretched out indefinitely, because there can also be the argument of moving a bit the goalposts. You know, we have different steps, and clearly it's immensely important that, and we have seen that from experience in the past, that we do not compromise on issues like those. But how can we avoid the impression a bit that the argument, it takes time, is seen a bit as an excuse of stretching out the whole process?
Well, just a few words about that. I mean, yes, but I will answer something quite different. I say the Venice Commission is very patient, and in fact, what we saw, even when we see that it takes time and we see that the process are long, probably it gives also time to the countries and to the authorities and to the democratic system being in force. And in fact, as far as the Venice Commission itself is concerned, we learned a lot. And what we saw is that when democracy is in progress, we saw also the resistance. We saw, and we are able now, not really have to have answers for everything. But what we saw, the stop and go is real, but we see also how the systems are in a capacity to use the legal terms of democracy, rule of law, just to play against democracy and rule of law. And I mean, probably you think that it's, yes, it could be lengthy, but we prefer the process to be lengthy than to be going backwards and backsliding. And you know, this, yes, I'm sure we cannot give answers on the point, yes, it's black and white and you're on the right way. Probably you're on the right way, but we have, and that's probably the main strength of the Venice Commission. It's not to give answers, yes, no, and quick answers, but to analyze what's going on. And this is the real importance. I'm sorry, I don't really answer to your question, but I mean, you know, that's the real strength of an expert body at the Venice Commission. Other the institutions, they will make their own way and they will make their own choices.
Madam Trajkovska, I think your country, North Macedonia, had a different experience because of politics coming in from different sides, which have, of course, meant that objective progress on the path to implementing measures, rule of law, judiciary, etc., have all been a bit subsumed for quite a long time, first by the dispute with Greece on the name, and then at the time when you thought that finally the hurdles would be resolved, another issue came up with another neighboring countries, and how does this impact basically on the reform movement, on judiciary and rule of law? Does it mean that this goes ahead independently, and once the political hurdles are removed, then basically you are already that much further advanced, or does it have a negative impact on the reform process as such?
Yes. Well, I think that we don't have much time, because we are in a process of reform since the independence, and your question about successful reforms and how to achieve successful judicial reforms is probably one of the most important and one of the, I will say, key elements for starting accession negotiations. And for that, we need independent judiciary. How to keep successful reforms when interference of different internal and external forces are influencing the structure of the judiciary, but also the success of the reforms. Let me give you one example. One of the surveys of the OSCE within judiciary last year is summing up that the judges are perceiving the stronger pressure that comes not from politics, but from the members of the Judicial Council, then from presidents of the courts, from business elite, and then from politics. And another sign which is pointing on this direction is also the statement of the previous president of the Judicial Council when she was resigning from her presidential position. She came with a clear statement that during her mandate, she was under strong pressure of judicial business elite. So we see that it's not only politicians and politics that are a kind of obstacle for improving the process of the reforms. And for that purpose, European accession should be perceived by broader public and by business and political elites from the perspective of the importance of independent judiciary as a fundamental precondition for successful accession to EU. But we, as you've said, how to react when accession negotiations are blocked, how to react when countries from West Balkan are receiving messages that the enlargement process will go slowly and there is no need to hurry up. It takes time and etc. Well, it's becoming even more complex because it's difficult to preserve stability, democracy, and progress if you don't have clear focus on the reforms of the independent judiciary. I think that the political elite, business elite, but judges also will have to accept that the judicial reforms are not short-term maybe goal, but it should be perceived that this is a long-term focus on the values of the core values for better democracy in the country. Because, as you said, Venice Commission is European Commission for Democracy through law. So this all is united in the role of the independent judiciary. And how to overcome all these pressures coming from inside and from outside? From my perspective, there should be strong diplomatic support for the independent judiciary on one side, and then on the other side, dialogue with Council of Europe, Venice Commission, but also with European institutions. I think that we judges in countries from West Balkan, we are lacking the privilege to be in constant dialogue with judges from Luxembourg. We do have our privilege to receive judgments from the European Court of Human Rights, but we need also constant dialogue with the court in Luxembourg. So yes, it's a long process, but I think for us, in this part of Europe, it takes too long.
So Grabenwarter, on this, I think goes back again to this question how to create a lasting constitutional culture. It's related also to the confidence, I think, of the public in every country in the judiciary. and having this confidence also obviously something which takes time. It's linked to a certain extent also to the way judges are nominated and appointed to prevent complete politicization. But that's not the only issue. You mentioned the experience with the judicial councils, which has been positive in most countries, but it's not a complete recipe against political appointees. In your discussions, Mr. Grabenwarter, how do you see this question if you discuss it with colleagues in the region?
I think, as we have seen just now with Mirjana describing the situation, it's a very complex issue. And I just want to add a few aspects to what she has said. First of all, of course, Luxembourg is an important court, but it is not a constitutional court. It has not the tradition of constitutional courts, and that means Luxembourg is learning itself becoming a constitutional court, and they would like to be faster, but it's not so easy. So we have to rely on constitutional courts of other member states of the Council of Europe and the European Union. Constitutional courts have been called in the United States discussion as the least dangerous branch because they don't have an army. But, and the big but is, they have their measures, and if they are well seen, they are not so undangerous as they seem. And this can contribute to the problems we are talking about. Quite a number of former members of the Venice Commission have become judges at the Strasbourg court. And they bring in their experience from the Venice Commission, but they bring their authority as judges and former members. The European Commission takes up Venice Commission decisions. Constitutional courts ask the Venice Commission for amicus curiae opinion. They do not do this because they don't want to have work. They do it because they want the authority of the Venice Commission. Now what we need, and this I would like to stress, we need a sustainable development. We do not need a judiciary that jumps over the bottom line just in the year of accession, but we need a judiciary which is integrated in a European cooperation of constitutional courts, which in the long term is resilient against backsliding. And therefore, I fully agree with you, we mustn't take too long time. Our task here sitting on the podium in various aspects is to care for that the homework is done. There may be other political aspects decisive for accession, but there's one precondition which is indispensable. You cannot have a free market economy without an independent judiciary. This is in the DNA of European integration. And irrespective of what is decided in accession proceedings, we have to care in bilateral contacts within the Venice Commission, looking after the case law of the European Court of Human Rights, that the judiciary is in a position, and constitutional courts in particular, to guarantee human rights, freedom, and the rule of law in a constitutional system which wants to be member of the European Union.
I would like to come back again to the special case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, if I may. You mentioned the crucial role of the Constitutional Court and also the presence of international judges in this very difficult ethno-national challenging context in the country. There has also been sometimes a bit the accusation, if I could say so, that there is outside pressure which tries to achieve change without really focusing too much on the diversities. Do you see that as a problem, that the feeling is that in the Dayton system and everything which followed up, the country is not really feeling that it's acting independently because there are still the institutions which were imposed on it? Or do you see on the other side that this is still an opening which could sort of accelerate the reform process eventually, also bringing back in the Republika Srpska in this whole legal framework and in a common judiciary?
I think for Bosnia, it's essential to really be an integrated part of Europe and to stay in Europe. And the Dayton Agreement was a first step because it made the weapons to be silent. But then the constitutional process had to be built up. And it's extremely difficult. We see even after 30 years, the tensions are actually more or less the same that they have been in the 1990s. We see, for example, this adoption of the UN resolution on the commemoration of Srebrenica, and we see the reaction in the Republika Srpska. So we see the wounds are still open, the compromises have not been found that should have been found. And I think in such a situation, it's really something, the peace process has to be a European process. So I don't think that it's an outside pressure, an unfair pressure, but the whole process has to be a part of European responsibility. And the institutions that were created in Dayton, they should be reformed. We know that the Sejdic and Finci judgment should be implemented. There should be no more ethnic division, but there should be diversity. All that is clear, but all that can only be brought about with the help of the neighboring countries, with the help of the EU, and also with the help of the Venice Commission, with the help of the European Court, with all these institutions that work for all European states, and they are especially needed in Bosnia. So I don't think that there is an unfair outside pressure, but on the contrary, I think this country really needs to go step hand in hand, so to say, with other European actors.
I have one question to all of you, or those who would like to respond to that. With the new methodology on accession, which was adopted in 2020, the Commission and also the Member States, the Council, tried to ensure that we could somehow make certain that any kind of reforms, the reforms of the judiciary, etc., are irreversible processes, that they are lasting, that they are sustainable. And this is why basically chapters 23 and 24 have benchmarks for the opening, but they are also, if you want, the final step before closing the accession negotiations to make sure that the requirements have been fulfilled. Now, we have seen in the case of previous accessions that the requirements were fulfilled at the moment of accession, but there has been backsliding, especially in the case of judiciary. You've seen that in Poland, in Hungary, other cases. And do you see any way of preventing that or making it less likely?
I'll try. I mean, there's some sort of, well, theoretical but also practical way of entering. The question is just about what is at stake in all the countries. When we're talking about constitutional courts, well, you know, the first time you be in France, in Germany, or whatever they are, the first question is, well, we have to change the judges. We have to put people who are not those who are at the moment there. And exactly the same problem as the judiciary. What is in an independent constitutional court? And all the political parties, if they don't agree with the decision of the constitutional court, and this is just an example, they will fire all the judges. I mean, we don't need any constitutional court, because the role of a constitutional court is to be able to oppose the authorities and say no. What is your mandate? Who puts you there? Yeah, so no, there has to be a sort of acceptance of people in an institutions which is there, which is composed that way and things like that, has to say no to political authorities. And that drives us to something very important. Democracy is a very complex system. And the problem at the moment is that to make the democracy works is a very, very difficult task for everybody. It is the most complex system because you require from every citizen to understand what is at stake when they vote, why they vote, and all of that brings back to the trust you have in the institutions. When you see this sort nowadays of public space, I don't want to always to criticize all the social medias, but in fact, the forum is on the internet. It's no more on the public space. It's no more in the judiciary, including the constitutional court. It's no more in the parliament. So how can we bring back trust? I really think that that's the problem. So I'm not answering another time to your question, but bring back to the fundamental principles and the fundamental things that make a democracy work. And that is why it is so complex, and that's why also all the countries in the accession process have to be aware of many, many things, and to know where is the major risk and what they have to do. There are 2 or 3 things that they have to be aware of, as in older countries. I'm not talking about what's going on in the States now, but checks and balances, yes. Okay. Separation of powers. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much. Maybe I could, please, Mr. Grabenwarter. Yeah.
May I add to this answer with an answer how to prevent backsliding with a comparison from the medical world. We shouldn't wait until a disease is there, but we should adjust the way of life, perhaps have vaccinations against illness. And this is about what the Venice Commission does. We have a document which is called the Rule of Law Checklist, which is under discussion now because we are redrafting certain parts. And one instrument of the Venice Commission is working with soft law recommendations. Some of them are not hard law, but soft law. And what we call European standards, you can compare to Mediterranean cuisine, just olive oil and so on, and put in the system elements which are observed in order to prevent that an avalanche starts sliding, because when something is sliding, it's too late. And that is basically the idea behind. And I'd like to give you an example, very, very, very concrete. Last week, some 30 representatives of constitutional courts met in Yerevan in a conference, which was also co-hosted by the Venice Commission. And what were 2 topics we discussed there, just for ways of example? One was the respect for binding decisions of constitutional courts, what strategies, and the second topic was media and constitutional courts. And Claire talked about trust. It's all about trust. if you don't trust in the judiciary, you don't have respect for decisions. If you don't have a media landscape which contributes to trust, it's not in the power of the courts to establish this. It's a precondition. As a former constitutional court judge in Germany has said, Ernst Wolfgang Böckenförde said, a constitutional state lives from the preconditions it cannot establish itself. And this is about, we need preconditions that are there, and the judiciary has to build upon them.
Yes.
Perhaps just on your question with this change in the philosophy of the EU, I think it's very correct. Because the Copenhagen criteria before, it was like marching up a step, and if you are up, then you don't care what you do. You are only watched as long as you walk on the step. And this mentality of having reached this upper level and then doing whatever you want, reforming the judiciary in a way that is really backsliding, this was a wrong signal, and it was clear in the 2000s and then 2010s for states having entered the system, then they are free to do whatever they can. And at least to have the signal now, no, we continue to talk about rule of law, to supervise, to have the dialogue on rule of law. That is already a big change. If you then can stop the backsliding, especially if you have an avalanche like we seem to have now, this is another question. But to change the philosophy, that was very important.
Thank you. Maybe I could see if there are questions from the audience. Yes, I see one here, 2, 3. Please, here in the third row.
Thank you. My name is Nathan Al-Bahar. I'm a former member of parliament here in Serbia and currently the international secretary for the Liberal Party Free Citizens Movement. When I was in parliament, one of the main topics of discussion was the judicial reforms that were taking place here in Serbia in the past 2 years. And we, as the pro-European opposition, had a lot of concerns with the reforms that were happening here because we felt that the autocratic government, which is not really interested in real reforms, was using it as a cover to get only the most basics changed, where it would still maintain a complete dominance of the judiciary and the High Judicial Council, and maintain its current hold, and of course not following rule of law that should be for a candidate country wanting to join the European Union. My question is, how do you address a country, an autocratic country, that is clearly has been backsliding in democratic freedoms and freedom of media, in the rule of law, that has no real intention of changing the system? How do you deal with that? Because a lot of us in civil society or in the pro-European opposition have expectations from the Venice Commission, from the European Commission, from the Council of Europe, to take a stronger voice and say things that when they're not functioning, they're not functioning. In the reports from the Venice Commission, the government was able to use certain aspects and say, well, we did get a positive opinion in the end. But if you actually read the opinion and the 5-6 pages, there's a lot of areas there, recommendations that even says were not implemented. And yet the overall impression was the Venice Commission gave a green light, therefore the reforms are good, Serbia is on its way of meeting its obligations, when in no way did the hold of politics in the judiciary get limited. So my question is, what do you do in this case, and how can either the European Commission, Venice Commission, or Council of Europe take a stronger approach in trying to solve the backsliding and no actual performance towards a rule of law reform? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe in the interest of time, we could group the 3 questions, I think, all together. There was one in the back here. Please.
One here.
Hi. Thank you for this very interesting and yet technical discussion. I'm Oleg Derue. I'm an international student from Brussels. My question is the following. everybody on the panel presented the rule of law like this kind of unshakable monolith that is very tough to implement and takes time and everything. Yet there is this kind of double standards towards accession policies that we could see between Ukraine and other Western Balkan countries, where some steps have been skipped or have taken an accelerated turn for integration of Ukraine, and yet some countries in Western Balkan have been trying to access the EU for more than 20 years. And my question was then, if reality has those kind of double standards, should there be some kind of accession policy reforms to make more of case-by-case integration of states to accommodate local disparities and local differences between future member states of the EU? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Was there one more question? And yes, please.
Here.
Thank you, Jelena Pejčnikić, researcher here at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy. Actually, colleague Natan Al-Bahari has already asked what I actually wanted, but he used Serbian example for a broader question, and I wanted to ask Ms. Bazy-Malaurie whether she has a comment on specific Serbian judicial reform, if she participated in many opinions that the Venice Commission has issued, and some are still pending. And the colleague already said that the civil society and professional associations were not quite satisfied, neither with the norms, and especially not with the results we've seen so far. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? If that's not the case, then could I ask the panelists maybe to reply to that, please?
Well, I will try to answer the question on double standards, as you've said. I think that this is indeed an important question because respect of rule of law and human rights are fundamental values of EU. And when member state country is demanding changes which are not prescribed by Copenhagen criteria and are linked with bilateral relations of the member state and accession country, then what is at stake in speaking about double standards is not just the complexity of the problem for accession country to preserve stability and progress in accession process, but also the question of integrity of the EU is raised. Because yes, it's true, EU is in a position to build criteria for accession. That criteria should be in line with fundamental values and rule of law as the pillar of the EU. And if those criteria are somehow misusing this path, then the credibility of EU is also under question mark. I will use the example of demand for constitutional changes of the North Macedonia. That this demand came immediately after the Prespa agreement. The promise was not kept, and suddenly there was a new demand. And we are now facing the skepticism of the country in immediate implementation of the constitutional changes due to the fact that there is no legal certainty that there will be a new list of new demands. This is so because when this demand was accepted, it was not based on the ground of fundamental principles of human rights protection, but on the ground of power of politics. Namely, the EU was somehow abandoning the fact that there are 16 judgments of the European Court of Human Rights concerning national minority of North Macedonia in the member state, and those judgments were not fulfilled. So you see, there is a I will say, unproportional approach when it comes to the criteria for starting accession negotiations, which are creating difficulties for the country in accession, but also it does create difficulties when it comes to the credibility of EU. And I think it's a double, let's say, double loss, not only for the accession country, but also for the credibility of EU.
If nobody else, you would...
Perhaps just on this question, what to do with a country which does not really have the good intentions, and then the Venice Commission assesses the legislative process. The Venice Commission adopts soft law instruments, so these opinions are soft law, and there is a danger of misuse. So we are polite, we write our opinions in a language where we always say, well, there's progress here and no progress there. And we see that governments sometimes take this first part of the sentence, there's progress, and they forget about the second part of the sentence where there's the critique. What we do is just to listen to the civil society. So as Claire has said, we always have the meetings with the civil society, and we try to avoid it. And sometimes we really even leave out the nice part of the sentence in order to make a very strong message. But as a rule, we try to see it as a part of a dialogue, and we hope that we are not misused.
Thank you very much. I think that finishes our discussion. Thank you very much for an engaged, and I hope for the audience also fruitful and interesting discussion. Thank you.